All right, let's get philosophical. Today we're taking a deep dive into temporal logic.
Sounds intense.
It can be, but don't worry, you asked for this deep dive, and we're going to make it fun, I promise. Especially for you, since you're coming at this with a philosophy background.
That's right, we're going to assume you already know your way around a philosophical argument or two.
Exactly, so no need for Logic 101 here. Instead, we're going straight for the good stuff.
Yeah, the stuff that'll make you go, aha, now I can use that to think about time in a whole new way.
Exactly. Think new angles on free will, determinism, the very nature of time, all those juicy philosophical problems.
We're talking about taking those head-scratchers that have kept philosophers up at night for centuries and giving them a formal makeover.
Ooh, a logic makeover. I like the sound of that.
And to do that, we'll explore how ancient philosophical puzzles about time can be expressed and analyzed using the rigorous language of logic.
Fancy. But will we also talk about things like McTaggart's A and B series?
Of course, we'll even touch upon how temporal logic can illuminate different conceptions of time like those.
Cool. But maybe before we go full-on logic nerd,
Haha, right.
maybe we should start with something a little more familiar, a classic philosophical puzzle to ease us in.
Perfect. A great starting point is the problem of future contingents.
Ah, yes. That old chestnut.
Aristotle's sea battle example is a classic illustration.
The one where we're asked if the statement, there will be a sea battle tomorrow, is true right now, even though the future hasn't happened yet.
Exactly. It's a problem that has fascinated and frustrated philosophers for centuries. Gets right to the heart of truth, time, possibility.
It's a deep rabbit hole for sure.
And it pops up everywhere. Diodorus, Cronus, William of Ockham, even the Bible wrestles with these ideas in its own way.
Wow, so we've got this ancient puzzle about the truth of future statements, tangled up with those massive debates about free will and determinism.
Yep, it's all connected.
So where does temporal logic come into the picture?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Back in the 1950s, a philosopher named Arthur Prior was wrestling with these very issues.
Oh, I've heard of him.
And he thought, I need some serious logical tools to sort this out. And that's basically how temporal logic was born, or at least what we now call temporal logic. Back then, it was called tense logic.
So Prior was like, hold my beer, I'm going to invent a whole new logic to deal with time.
Pretty much. And that is the star of our deep dive today.
Intriguing. But before we dive into the specifics of Prior's system, how do logicians even represent time when they're building these formal systems?
That's a great question because it really shakes the kind of logic you can build. There are two main approaches.
Okay, lay it on me.
First, we can use points. Think of them like instants, tiny snapshots of time.
So like capturing a single moment.
Exactly. The other approach is to use intervals. Those represent stretches of time, like, say, the duration of this deep dive.
Okay, I can picture that, points and intervals. But why does that choice even matter philosophically? Seems pretty technical.
Ah, but you know what they say, the devil is in the details. And sometimes those details have really profound philosophical implications.
I've been burned by those details before.
So for example, think about our immediate experience of time. It feels like a series of nows, right?
It does, yeah, like a constant flow of present moments.
Right. So if we want to ground our understanding of time in that direct experience, we might lean towards a model based on instants, kind of like McTaggart's A-series view of time.
Ah, so the way we model time and logic can actually reflect different philosophical positions on the nature of time.
Precisely. On the other hand, if we want to emphasize the way events flow into one another, a model based on intervals might feel more natural, more like McTaggart's B-series.
So even before we get to the logic itself, our very choice of how to represent time is already entangled with these big philosophical debates.
Exactly. And using these models, whether based on points or intervals, we can formally define a whole range of properties of time. We can talk about time being linear, meaning it flows in one direction, or branching, where the future splits into different possibilities.
Like a choose-your-own-adventure novel.
Aha, exactly. We can explore dense time, where between any two moments there's always another one, or discrete time, where moments are distinct, like clicks of a clock.
So instead of just having these vague ideas about time, we can actually analyze its structure with real precision.
Exactly. Though, gotta be honest, some properties of time, like the idea of continuity, are tricky to capture formally. We might need to get into higher-order logic for that, but that's a whole other story.
A story for another time, perhaps.
Haha, maybe. But for now, let's stick with the revolution that Arthur Prior brought about with his tense logic.
Sounds good to me. So how did Prior actually capture those tricky temporal notions? The it was the case and it will be the case kind of statements. Did he just throw some time words into regular logic?
He did something much more radical. He brought time inside the logic itself, made it a core part of the system rather than just an add-on.
Whoa, that sounds intense. How did he do that?
He introduced these special temporal operators, kind of like the modal operators you might know from modal logic, but instead of dealing with possibility and necessity, they deal with the past and the future.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are these temporal operators? Give me the symbols.
All right, here they come. First up, P for past. So P followed by a statement means it was the case that. Then we have F for future. That means it will be the case that.
Okay, those are pretty straightforward.
Right, and then to capture those always concepts, we have H for always has been and G for always will be.
Ooh, I like it. I can already see myself dropping these into philosophical arguments. But can you give me a quick example, something snappy to make these feel more concrete?
How about this? It will always be true that Plato wrote dialogues.
Nice. Classic philosophy example.
We can formalize that in prior tense logic as G.P. Plato wrote dialogues. It captures that nested temporal relationship quite nicely, don't you think?
It's surprisingly elegant. But I have to ask, how is this really different from just using regular first-order logic to talk about time? Could we do the same thing with predicates and variables and whatnot?
That's where Prior's genius shines. In standard first-order logic, we usually handle time by introducing time variables and predicates like occurs at time t. But prior tense logic bakes those temporal notions directly into the operators themselves. It's a fundamental shift in perspective.
Okay, I see the difference. But just for clarity's sake, could you briefly touch on how prior tense logic could be translated into first-order logic, just to see the connection?
Sure, we won't get too technical, but essentially, each of those temporal operators can be mapped onto a more complex first-order expression. The key takeaway is that prior tense logic is much more concise, and some would say more intuitive for expressing those complex temporal relationships.
Got it. So we have these new tools, these temporal operators, that are now part of the logic itself. But how does this connect back to the big philosophical picture? I'm dying to see how this plays out in those classic debates about time.
Now you're talking. Remember McTaggart's A series and B series of time?
Of course, how could I forget? The A series is all about that lived experience of time, with the ever-shifting now always dividing the past from the future. The B series is more static, just a series of events ordered by earlier than and later than.
Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting. Prior's tense logic, with its P for past and F for future, seems to align pretty naturally with McTaggart's A series, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It captures that tensed, present-focused perspective that we experience so directly.
You got it. By choosing to work with tense logic, we're kind of implicitly embracing a view of time that's dynamic and centered on the present moment.
So the logic itself has a kind of philosophical flavor baked in.
It's not necessarily about taking sides in the A series versus B series debate, but recognizing that our choice of logical framework carries with it certain philosophical commitments.
That's subtle but important. We're not just playing with symbols here, we're engaging with fundamental questions about how we understand reality.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And it's speaking of different conceptions of time, let's bring in an operator that's especially important when we're dealing with discrete time.
Discrete time. Now that brings to mind those philosophers who see time as a series of distinct, indivisible moments, like clicks on a cosmic clock.
Right on. In discrete time, we can introduce the X operator.
X marks the spot.
It stands for next time, or sometimes tomorrow. It's hugely important in computer science, where systems often operate in discrete steps.
Makes sense. But it also has philosophical implications, right?
Absolutely. For anyone who views time as fundamentally quantized, a sequence of snapshots rather than a smooth flow.
So X lets us hop to the next moment in time, but only if we're assuming there is a next moment to hop to.
Precisely. It's like a fast-forward button on a film reel. Works great if time is structured like individual frames, but not so much if it's a continuous flow.
Okay, I'm with you so far.
And if we combine X with the assumption of linear time, things get even more interesting. That's where two other powerful operators come in. Since and until.
Since and until. Sounds pretty familiar. We use those words all the time.
Right, and they work pretty intuitively in temporal logic, too. For instance, you want to express the idea that I've been studying philosophy since I was a teenager.
A true philosopher in the making.
We can formalize that using the since operator as studying philosophy since being a teenager.
Oh, I see.
And for future statements, we can use until, like, I'll keep recording this podcast until my voice gives out.
Hopefully not anytime soon.
Fingers crossed. But what makes since and until especially powerful is that when you apply them to linear time, they can express any statement that's definable in first-order logic, at least as far as temporal relationships are concerned.
Wow, really? So like they unlock this hidden expressive power within the logic.
It's a pretty remarkable result, and it turns out this kind of linear time logic, often called LTL, is really important in computer science too. It's used for analyzing and verifying how computer programs behave over time.
So the same tools we use to think about time are also used to make sure our computers don't crash.
In a way, yes, it highlights how these seemingly different fields are actually connected by the underlying power of logic. But speaking of time, maybe we should shift gears a bit.
Lead the way.
Let's move from linear time to something a bit more, shall we say, adventurous.
Ooh, I love an adventure. What are we talking about?
Branching time.
Branching time. That's where things get really interesting when it comes to free will, right?
You bet. Branching time gives us a model where the past is linear, but the future branches out into multiple possibilities.
So at any given moment, there are multiple possible futures, each represented by a different branch.
Exactly. Think of it like a tree, with time flowing up the trunk and then branching out in different directions.
So, does that mean we can't even talk about the future anymore, only about possible futures?
That's a great question, and it really depends on how we interpret that future operator f in a branching time framework.
Okay, I'm all ears.
There are two main approaches, each named after a famous philosopher: Peircean branching time and Occamist branching time.
Two for the price of one. Let's start with Pierce. What's the Peircean take on the future?
Well, in Peircean branching time, f has a very strong meaning. It means necessarily will be.
Necessarily will be. That sounds pretty absolute.
It is. It means that for a statement about the future to be true, it has to be true in all possible futures.
So if I say I will eat pizza tomorrow, that's not actually true in the Peircean view, because there might be some possible future where I suddenly become lactose intolerant.
Exactly. In Peircean branching time, you'd have to say, it's possible that I'll eat pizza tomorrow.
So every statement about the future turns into a statement about possibilities and necessity.
Right, we lose that plain, straightforward future truth.
That's a pretty radical way to think about the future. And it definitely puts a dent in any simple notion of determinism.
For sure. But this strong interpretation of f has some other interesting consequences too. For example, one classic formula in temporal logic, IA minus HF phi, which basically implies a kind of necessity of the past, is no longer valid in Peircean branching time.
Well, hold on. So we're already seeing how these formal tools can be used to analyze and even potentially challenge those classic philosophical arguments.
Exactly. And it even challenges Diodorus Cronus's master argument, which relies on that very formula.
Philosophy nerds, take note.
Another interesting consequence is that it invalidates the principle of future excluded middle. That's the principle that says either f phi or f not phi has to be true.
Wait, so that means either something will be the case or it won't. Seems pretty basic, doesn't it?
You'd think so, right? But the Peircean view says, hold on, not that fast. Because there are multiple possible futures, neither f phi or f not phi is necessarily true right now. There might be some futures where phi is true and others where it's false, so we can't say for sure what will happen on this specific timeline.
Okay, my head's starting to spin a little. We've got this strong modalized future in the Peircean view. What about Occamist branching time? How does that handle the future?
Well, the Occamist view takes a different approach. It says truth is relative to a specific history, a particular path through those branches of time.
So like we're picking out one specific storyline from all the possible ones.
Exactly. And in that case, f is interpreted as on this particular timeline, will be.
Okay. So in the Occamist view, if I say I will eat pizza tomorrow, I am making a claim about what will happen, but only on the specific timeline I'm currently on.
You nailed it. This allows for a notion of plain future truth, even in a branching time framework. But it also raises some tricky questions about how to interpret this history or timeline itself. Is it the actual predetermined course of events, or is it more like an auxiliary parameter we use to make sense of future truth?
Those are some deep philosophical waters. And I'm sensing a connection here to those thin red line theories and supervaluationism we mentioned earlier.
You're right on track. The Occamist view opens up a whole can of worms about possibility, the open future, and how language deals with these concepts. But before we get too lost in those weeds, maybe it's time to look at a different way of modeling time altogether. One that moves away from instants and embraces intervals as the fundamental building blocks.
Intervals, as in stretches of time. Sign me up. I'm curious to see how that changes things.
Interval-based logics offer a really unique perspective on temporal reasoning. Instead of evaluating truth at individual instants, we evaluate it at intervals.
So instead of saying this is true at 2 p.m., we'd say this is true during the interval from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m.
Precisely. And this shift lets us capture relationships between intervals.
Okay, so not just point-to-point relations anymore, but interval-to-interval relations. That makes sense. What are some of the interesting logics that have come out of this approach?
Well, one of the most prominent is the HS system. It was developed by Halpern and Schuham, and it's pretty fascinating.
HS, is that short for something?
It's just their initials. But what makes HS particularly cool is that it uses Allen's interval relations.
Allen's interval relations. I haven't heard of those.
They're a set of 13 basic relations that describe how intervals can relate to each other. You have meets, overlaps, starts, finishes, and so on.
13. That's a lot.
It sounds like a lot, but they're actually quite intuitive. You can even picture them with simple diagrams.
I do love a good visual.
And in HS logic, each of these relations gets its own operator.
So we can really get specific about how different stretches of time relate to each other?
Exactly. This makes it incredibly expressive. You can represent all sorts of complex temporal patterns, but that expressiveness comes at a cost. HS logic is often undecidable.
Undecidable. Meaning?
It means there's no algorithm that can always tell us whether a statement in HS logic is logically valid or not. It's like sometimes the logic itself leaves us with a bit of mystery.
Ooh, I like a logic with some mystery.
Me too, but it does make things a bit more challenging. But hey, who said philosophy was easy?
Definitely not me. And speaking of challenges, are there other cool variants of temporal logic out there? Beyond the basics we've covered so far?
Oh, tons. The world of temporal logic is vast and diverse. There are hybrid logics, which can actually refer to specific time points within the logic. Then there are metric or real-time logics, which add units of time to our reasoning. So you can say things like, this will happen within 5 seconds.
Yeah, that's precise.
Right. And then there's quantified propositional logic, which kind of blurs the line between propositional and first-order logic.
It's like there's a whole universe of temporal logics out there, each with its own quirks and capabilities.
And it's worth remembering that good old Arthur Prior, our temporal logic pioneer, actually had a hand in developing many of these. He really laid the groundwork for a rich and ever-expanding field.
Impressive. It's like he gave us the keys to the temporal logic kingdom, and now we're free to explore all its hidden corners.
That's a great way to put it. But so far, we've mostly been at the propositional level, dealing with statements and their truth values. What about first-order temporal logic? How does that bring objects and their changing properties into the picture?
That's what I've been waiting for. It's one thing to say, it was raining yesterday, but I want to be able to say Socrates was wet yesterday because it was raining. Get specific. Talk about things in the world.
You wrote my mind. First-order temporal logic, or FOTL, takes us beyond just talking about what's true at different times. It allows us to talk about things in the world and how their properties change over time.
Finally, some philosophical action.
And with that action comes a whole new set of philosophical questions.
Oh, I bet. Like what?
Well, one of the big ones is, how do those quantifiers, the for all and there exists statements, actually work in a temporal setting?
Yeah, that's a good point. If I say every philosopher writes a book, do I mean every philosopher who ever existed? Or just the ones who are alive right now? Time really complicates those quantifiers.
It definitely does. And that leads to two main approaches to quantification in first-order temporal logic: presentist quantification and eternalist quantification.
Present versus eternalist. Okay, I'm sensing a theme here. Those terms sound familiar from other philosophical debates.
They do pop up all over the place, don't they? In this context, presentism basically means we're only talking about the things that exist right now when we use those quantifiers. It's a very present moment-focused way of thinking about existence. Eternalism, on the other hand, throws the doors wide open and says that our quantifiers encompass everything that ever existed, past, present, and future.
So it's like presentism gives us a snapshot of existence at this particular moment, while eternalism gives us the whole sprawling panorama of everything that ever was, is, or will be.
That's a great analogy. You've really captured the essence of the distinction. And this seemingly simple choice has some pretty significant implications for how we interpret statements, especially statements about the past or the future.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, let's go back to that sentence we were talking about before. Every philosopher writes a book.
All right, I'm ready for round 2 with that sentence.
So under a presentist reading, that sentence might actually be true. Maybe, just by chance, every single philosopher alive today has in fact written a book. But from an eternalist perspective, that sentence is probably false. After all, there have been countless philosophers throughout history, and it's highly unlikely that every single one of them managed to write a book.
So the truth of that sentence can change depending on whether we're wearing our presentist or eternalist glasses when we interpret that every quantifier. Mind-blowing. It really shows how a seemingly straightforward statement can become a philosophical minefield when we add the element of time.
It's a perfect example of how temporal logic forces us to be more precise with our language and to confront those hidden assumptions that we often carry around with us. And speaking of confronting assumptions, there's a famous formula in modal logic that gets even more interesting when we bring it into the world of temporal logic, the Barkin formula.
Ooh, the Barkin formula. Sounds almost mythical. What makes it so special in a temporal context?
Well, think of the Barkin formula as a kind of bridge between those quantifiers, which tell us about what exists, and the modal operators, which in temporal logic are our trusty friends f and p, telling us about what's true at different times. The Barkin formula and its converse essentially allow us to move those quantifiers in and out of the scope of those temporal operators.
So it's like we're playing a game of logic chess, moving those quantifiers and operators around to see what happens.
Exactly. And the philosophical question we're trying to answer is this: is the Barkin formula and its converse valid in a temporal logic?
Valid meaning it always holds true no matter what.
Right. And the answer, as you might expect in philosophy, is it depends.
Of course. Depends on what, in this case.
It depends on our underlying assumptions about how existence and time are connected, specifically about those domains of quantification and how they change or don't change over time.
Okay, give me a concrete example here. My brain needs something to latch on to.
Okay, picture a world where we're working with something called constant domain semantics. In this world, everything that ever exists is always part of the domain, no matter what point in time we're talking about. In that kind of setting, the Barkin formula tends to be valid. It holds up under scrutiny.
So in that world, existence is like a fixed set, and time just kind of flows over it.
Exactly. But things get a lot trickier when we move to a world with varying domain semantics. In this world, the domain of what exists can actually change over time. Things can pop into existence and then disappear. And in those cases, the Barkin formula might not always hold true.
So the validity of this seemingly abstract formula can actually reveal something about our deepest assumptions about how time and existence are related.
That's the beauty of it. It's like a window into those fundamental philosophical commitments that we often make without even realizing it.
It's like those assumptions are hiding in the logic itself, waiting to be uncovered.
Exactly. But we've been focusing on first-order temporal logic all by itself. What if we start mixing it with other types of logic? Think epistemic logic, logic of agency, even spatial logic.
Ooh, now we're talking. My interdisciplinary heart is fluttering with excitement. Give me the details.
Imagine combining temporal logic with epistemic logic, which focuses on knowledge and belief. This would open up a whole new avenue for exploring how knowledge changes over time. We could ask questions like, what does it even mean to know something in a temporal context? Does knowledge persist over time? Or does it fade, get updated, or even completely disappear?
Wow, those are great questions. It's like taking those classic debates about knowledge and belief and adding this whole new dimension of temporality.
Exactly. We could even use this combined logic to analyze real-world scenarios, like the reliability of eyewitness testimony or the challenges of historical interpretation.
This is getting me really excited. What about combining temporal logic with logics of agency? That seems like it would be super relevant to all those debates about free will and determinism that we keep circling back to.
You're right on the money. By combining temporal logic with logics of agency, we can create formal systems that actually help us analyze how actions affect the future. We can explore the relationship between intentions, actions, and consequences, and even model different notions of free will within a temporal framework.
This is blowing my mind. It's like we're building a whole new toolbox for thinking about these age-old philosophical problems.
And to add one more layer of mind-bending awesomeness, we can even combine temporal logic with spatial logic.
Whoa, hold on. Spatial logic. I don't think we've talked about that one yet.
Spatial logic is all about reasoning about space and spatial relationships. Things like next to, above, inside, that sort of thing.
Okay, I can see how that would be useful. But how does it fit in with temporal logic?
Well, if we combine them, we get a logic that can handle both space and time. And that, my friend, is pretty essential for understanding modern physics, especially the idea of space-time as a unified concept.
It's like we've gone from analyzing the tense of a single sentence to pondering the very fabric of the universe.
And it all started with that simple idea of adding a temporal dimension to logic.
It's truly incredible how much philosophical and scientific ground we've covered. And to think, we've only just scratched the surface.
It really is amazing. But I think it might be time to start wrapping things up for today.
I agree. Time does seem to fly when you're having fun with temporal logic. Looking back at this whole deep dive, what would you say are the key takeaways for our philosopher listener?
I think one big takeaway is the sheer diversity of temporal logics out there. There's not just one right way to capture time in a formal system, and each of these logics has its own strengths and weaknesses, its own philosophical flavor, so to speak. We've seen how these logics can be used to make philosophical ideas more precise, to analyze arguments, and even to challenge long-held assumptions.
It's like we've expanded our philosophical toolkit, giving ourselves new ways to think and argue about time and its relation to everything else.
Exactly. And for me, personally, what I find most fascinating about temporal logic is how it reveals those hidden philosophical commitments that we often bring to the table without even realizing it. When we choose a particular way to model time in logic, we're implicitly making choices about what we think time is, how it flows, and how it relates to other aspects of reality.
It's like temporal logic is a mirror, reflecting back our own underlying beliefs about the universe.
I like that. And it's a mirror that can help us become more aware of those beliefs and to critically examine them in a way that everyday language often doesn't allow.
So it's not just about finding the right logic, but about using logic as a tool for philosophical exploration and self-discovery.
Beautifully put. And who knows what new insights and discoveries await us as we continue to explore this amazing field.
I can't wait to find out. And on that note, I think it's time for us to say goodbye for now. But before we do, I have one final thought-provoking question for our listener. We've been talking a lot about the formal representation of time in logic. But what about our subjective experience of time? How do those formal models and operators connect to the way we actually feel the flow of time, that sense of knownness that seems so central to our lived experience? It's something to ponder as you continue your own explorations into the fascinating world of temporal logic.
That is a great question. Perhaps one for a future deep dive. Until then, keep those philosophical gears turning and don't be afraid to dive deep into those logical rabbit holes. You never know what you might have ever. It really does. And this choice, this seemingly simple choice between presentist and eternalist quantification, it actually has big implications for how we interpret statements, especially this tricky statements about the past or the future.
Okay, I'm starting to see this is more than just a technical detail. It's like we're getting into some deep philosophical territory here.
We are, and to illustrate just how deep, let's go back to that sentence we were playing with earlier. Every philosopher writes a book.
Ah, yes, our old friend. I'm ready to wrestle with it some more.
Excellent. Now remember, under a presentist reading, that sentence might actually be true. It's possible that just by pure chance, every single philosopher alive today has actually written a book. But from an eternalist perspective, the odds of that being true are pretty slim. After all, there have been countless philosophers throughout history, and it's unlikely that every single one of them managed to put pen to paper, so to speak.
So the truth of that sentence, that seemingly simple sentence, can actually shift depending on whether we're looking at it through a presentist or an eternalist lens. That's wild. It really highlights how even the most straightforward statements can become philosophical puzzles when we bring time into the picture.
It does, doesn't it? And it's a great example of how temporal logic can force us to be more precise with our language, to really think about those hidden assumptions we often bring to the table without even realizing it. And speaking of hidden assumptions, there's a famous formula in modal logic that becomes even more interesting when we apply it to temporal logic, the Barkin formula.
Okay, the Barkin formula. I have to admit, I've heard that name thrown around in philosophical discussions, but I've never really understood what it's all about. Can you break it down for me? What makes it so intriguing in the context of temporal logic?
Of course. Think of the Barkin formula as a bridge. It connects those quantifiers, the for all, and there exists that tell us about what exists, with the modal operators, which in temporal logic are our F and P, the operators that tell us about what's true at different times. Essentially, the Barkin formula and its converse allows us to shift those quantifiers in and out of the scope of those temporal operators. It's a bit like a logic puzzle, seeing how these different pieces fit together.
So we can play around with the order of those quantifiers and temporal operators, and depending on how we arrange them, we might get different results.
You got it. And that leads us to a really intriguing philosophical question. Is the Markin formula and its converse valid in temporal logic?
Valid meaning it always holds true, no matter what.
Exactly. And the answer, as with many things in philosophy, is it depends.
Okay, I should have seen that coming. Depends on what in this case?
Well, it depends on our underlying assumptions about how existence and time are related. Specifically, it hinges on how we think about those domains of quantification. What things are we actually quantifying over when we use those for all and there exist statements? And how do those domains change or don't change over time?
Okay, this is where my brain starts to feel a little overloaded. Can you give me a more concrete example of how this plays out?
Sure. Imagine we're working with what's called constant domain semantics. In this world, everything that ever exists is considered part of the domain, no matter what point in time we're talking about. So past, present, future, it's all one big, unchanging set of things that exist. In this kind of setting, the Barkin formula tends to be valid. It holds up under scrutiny.
So in this constant domain world, existence is like a fixed set, and time just kind of flows over it.
That's a great way to visualize it. But now, let's imagine we shift to a world with varying domain semantics. In this world, the domain of what exists can actually change over time. Things can pop into existence and things can cease to exist.
So it's more dynamic. Existence itself is fluid.
Exactly. And in those cases, the Barkan formula might not always hold true. It starts to break down at the edges, so to speak.
Wow, so the validity of this seemingly abstract technical formula can actually tell us something about our deepest assumptions about how time and existence are related. It's like those assumptions are hiding in the logic itself, waiting to be uncovered.
You've hit the nail on the head. The Barkan formula acts like a litmus test, revealing whether we're implicitly committed to a view where things pop in and out of existence, or whether everything that will ever be, in some sense, already is. It's a really powerful tool for exploring those foundational questions about being and becoming.
This is mind-blowing. But we've been so focused on first-order temporal logic all by itself. I can't help but wonder, what happens when we start mixing it with other kinds of logic? Like, could we combine it with epistemic logic, the logic of knowledge and belief? Or maybe even with logic of agency, which deals with actions and their consequences?
Absolutely. That's where things get really exciting, in my opinion. Combining temporal logic with other logical systems is like creating a whole new set of tools for analyzing complex phenomena that involve not just time, but also knowledge, action, and even space.
My brain is buzzing with possibilities. Give me some concrete examples. I need to hear how this plays out in practice.
Okay, imagine weaving together temporal logic with epistemic logic. This would give us a way to explore how knowledge itself changes over time. We could ask questions like, what does it even mean to know something in a temporal context? Does knowledge persist unchanged over time? Or does it get updated, revised, maybe even completely forgotten?
Those are great questions, and it makes me think about how we rely on memory, testimony, and historical records to access knowledge about the past. All of those sources are subject to change and interpretation over time. It's like we're taking those classic debates about knowledge and belief and adding a whole new dimension of temporality.
Exactly. And we could use this combined logic to model how individuals and communities acquire, share, and revise their knowledge over time. It could even help us analyze the reliability of different sources of information, especially when we're dealing with events that happened in the past.
I love how this is bridging the gap between abstract logic and those real-world issues of how we understand and interpret the past. What about combining temporal logic with logic of agency? It seems like that would be really relevant to all those philosophical debates we keep having about free will and determinism.
You're absolutely right. By combining temporal logic with those logics of agency, we can create formal systems that allow us to analyze how actions affect the future. We can explore the relationship between intention, action, and consequence, and even start to model different notions of free will within a temporal framework.
This is incredible. It's like we're building a whole new conceptual toolbox for tackling some of the most enduring philosophical puzzles.
And it gets even wilder. What if we combine temporal logic with spatial logic?
Whoa, hold on. Spatial logic. We haven't even touched on that one yet. Fill me in.
Spatial logic focuses on reasoning about space and spatial relationship, things like next to, above, inside, that sort of thing. It allows us to capture those spatial aspects of our experience in a formal way.
Okay, I can see how that would be useful in its own right, but how does it connect with temporal logic? I'm having trouble wrapping my head around that combination.
Well, when we combine them, we get a logic that can handle both space and time simultaneously. It allows us to reason about events and objects, not just in terms of when they happen, but also where they happen. And that, my friend, is essential for understanding modern physics, where space-time is the very fabric of reality.
Whoa, we've gone from analyzing the tense of a single sentence to pondering the structure of the universe itself. That's quite a journey.
It is, isn't it? It's a testament to the power of logic to take us from the mundane to the profound, from the everyday to the cosmic.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of temporal logic. We've covered a lot of ground, from the basics of tense operators to the complexities of first-order temporal logic, branching time, interval logic, and even those mind-bending combinations with other logical systems.
It's been quite a ride, and I hope our listeners, especially those with a philosophical bent, have come away with a renewed appreciation for the power of logic to help us understand time, existence, knowledge, action, and even the very fabric of reality.
I second that. Temporal logic offers a unique and incredibly powerful lens for examining some of the most fundamental questions that humans have been grappling with for centuries. It's a field that's full of surprises, challenges, and most importantly, opportunities for deep and meaningful exploration. So to all our listeners out there, keep those philosophical gears turning. Don't be afraid to dive into those logical rabbit holes, and who knows what amazing insights and discoveries you might uncover. Until next time, happy philosophizing.